Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about caliber. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how long would you say that it typically takes you to judge the caliber of a software engineer? Mm, let's say a few months. Depends a bit on it depends on the work structure. It's very difficult for me to pinpoint a person's strengths and weaknesses without working next to them. Uh, but I would say that uh, it takes me 15 minutes roughly to know how senior they are. Doesn't take much longer than that. It depends. It depends a little bit on communication style as well, because some people are, it's difficult to tell whether or not they actually know anything or if they're just bad at communicating, or like vice versa. That can be a challenge, but usually it's not that hard to figure out seniority. But when it comes to, which I've talked about before, guys, the difference between seniority and like skill, talent, things like that, is usually not something that you're going to be able to figure out on just figuring out seniority. You can get very good indicators because a lot of people have a lot of knowledge related to good practices and how to apply them correctly and so forth. I usually figure that out very easily because usually in an interview, for example, people give you different levels of an answer where, if you ask a junior level software developer what's the hardest thing in software development, they will give you like an answer like, I don't know, CSS or tests or something like that. Whereas and a senior level software developer who doesn't really know so much, who's sort of shitty at that, is like will give you a skin deep like sort of nothing answer like, oh yeah, meeting expectations is difficult, or scope creep is something difficult. It's a more advanced answer, and you can probably talk about that a little bit. But the really, really, really good software developers, they usually will follow up these like a senior level answer with a fairly like very concrete examples, and usually like different thoughts that they've had related to it or approaches that they've used in order to solve issues and so forth and so forth. Like they're usually so in tune with the issues that they can give you a pretty good idea of how they think about their problems and sort of how they actually go about solving them. And these are the sort of people that usually give you very good indicators, because there's a lot of senior level software developers who are who are basically useless. Like they're not worth a senior level salary. They're basically mid-level developers walking around with the mannerisms and so forth of someone who is more experienced. And the figuring out of where that difference is cannot always be determined at the interviewing stage. Sometimes you actually have to work with the person. So as an example, if I interview someone who seems to be fairly experienced, and in many cases I can hear warning flags from them and so forth. Like they have, as I was saying, like I can basically tell my managers or like the hiring managers and so forth that this is an individual who has a fairly high skill level in terms of like knowledge level of all the tools. And then I explain to them, but at the same time I can also tell that it's difficult for me to tell how well they're going to be able to do on their own, or like how well they're going to structure code and so forth, because you don't really know how a person will submit code, how they will think about the specific product they're dealing with. And an example would be you might have individuals who are extremely knowledgeable, but they don't really know anything about, say, testing, or rather they might know about it, but they don't actually write any tests, or they're actually really shit at it, or they're really shit at some part of the process that might, and it might be that the thing that they're not so good at is something that they're going to stay pretty bad at, and then for your specific project it might be something that is very critical for you to get right. To give you a concrete example of that, I meet a lot of, say, front-end developers who are good at UX, user experience stuff, but they suck at everything related to testing or quality or like architecture or like basically these sorts of things. And what usually happens, and this is why I argue that most of front-end code bases are absolute shit, is because they learn the tools to just produce a UI, but they don't actually do that really well, especially well. And so the bugginess or like the quality of the overall system usually starts falling because they're actually really shit at something that is very critical to the overall health of the system. And in well, depending on the product and so forth, if it's a smaller scale project, that's fine, because usually the system doesn't grow so big that this becomes a big problem. But in the wrong scenario, and in teams that I've worked with quite a few times now, where you have high complexity system on the interface level, you need people like that. And I work with so many of these developers who they can't measure up. Simple as that. It just is not possible for them to learn how to, or rather it takes an enormous amount of investment from the company, and me, especially me in this case, to train them or to make them understand, even at the senior level, even if they after they work for 10 15 years, they don't really have this down. The problem with this is that unless you have an interviewing process or something like that where you can sort of figure out that this is the norm, really, honest to God, guys, this is the norm for most front-end developers especially, and even the back-end developers as well. I've seen this many times before. I've talked to, have had a conversation with back-end developers who are fairly experienced and they seem to know what they're doing, and then after a few months of working, I start to realize that actually they're pretty shit at this, or rather they're shit at things that are very important for this system. Examples would be I like to go back to testing because it's the number one weakness of practically every single software team I've ever worked with. It's not that I think that testing is the most important thing in the world. It's more a question of that it's a foundational, it's a cornerstone area of every software project, yet so many people suck at doing it, and if you do it right, it's actually the easiest thing in the world. But even when you talk to someone who seems really, really experienced and has a wide range of knowledge of different areas, they struggle with this to the point where most of them either don't care about it, or they sort of don't even consider that this is an area that they need to improve in. And so when you talk to people, you can't really figure that out until you start working with them. And that's when you start seeing the pattern. That's what I usually say. So you start working with them, you see their pull requests and so forth, and you can very quickly spot, okay, this is a person who never writes tests, or this is a person who, when asked writing tests, they don't actually know how to do it. This is a person who is fairly sloppy, like never Boy Scouts, for example. This is a shim programmer. He or she won't actually try to talk to anybody or anything like that. They will just try to fit in their requirements, whatever that might be, into the existing functionality. They won't refactor, or they won't do anything like that. This person doesn't know anything about architecture, all their abstractions are really weird or things like that. These sorts of things, you can never tell that until you start working with them for a little while, and most engineering managers won't actually be able to figure out that until the problem is much too great. Usually the thing that they figure out is, oh, this person is slow, for example. But when I work with software developers, I can actually see their code and I can see how they work, and I start to sort of see a pattern in, okay, this is the stuff that this person does really well, and this is the stuff that they're really, really bad at, in my opinion, at the very least. So, and that takes a month or two at the very least. So what I want you to take away from this is that I would say it takes me a few months to figure out the caliber of a software developer. The reason being because it can take 15 minutes to figure out seniority levels and sort of know if they know all the tools and so forth. But you need a big enough sample size in order to, or a history, like a track record, to refer to where you have seen the work being done. Because everybody under the sun will claim, oh, they know all the tools and they know all of these things, right? And if you deal with someone who really knows that, you usually can hear it in their voice. But in many cases, that doesn't necessarily mean that they know all the things that is going to matter for your specific team. And so the only way you can really figure that out is to hire them, put them in the team based on having a good gut feeling about them after interviews and things like that, because I mean you can't give them a code challenge that gives you all of this basically, and then you work with them for a little while and you start seeing that they always say, for example, struggle with ops. They don't really know anything about networking or infrastructure or Kubernetes or whatever it might be. Like they can't figure that out, or they know nothing about testing, or they're really shit at that, or they're really good at say abstractions, or they're really good at code reviews or things like that. You really have to be in the environment a little while with them before you can figure that out, and usually it takes a few months before a person becomes truly comfortable in a new team environment, and that's when you start to sort of see like the pattern of where like their weaknesses are and where their strengths are. Have a great day.